Hello, everyone, and welcome to my podcast. Let me give an introduction before I continue. Today's podcast, and my first one in a while, is going to focus on ableism in the Star Wars universe, specifically ableism amongst certain villains. This podcast, like most of my podcasts from now on, is actually going to be read from a post I made on my blog not too long ago. What I'm going to do is read the post and give some thoughts about it if I have any after, and that's how the format's going to be from now on. My podcasts from here on out are simply going to be, or primarily going to be, social justice within sci-fi fandoms, specifically Star Wars. If that isn't your thing, then don't listen. If it is, I hope you enjoy. And with that said, I will begin. So the post itself is titled Maw, Savage, Grievous, and Ableism. When discussing ableism amongst villains in Star Wars, I always feel that Maw is left out of discussions. Maw, Savage, and even Grievous. And to make matters worse, Maw was subjected to in-canon ableism by Ahsoka and Obi-Wan, though at different times. I've seen a lot of discussion about Vader and ableism, and I think that those discussions are good. The trope of the disabled villain isn't only bad in general, but it is bad for disabled people in real life who have to look towards mass murderers for representation. And when looking at Vader, one of the most famous villains in history who is disabled, and it's important to discuss the disabled villain trope. That said, I don't really think I've seen in-depth discussion when it comes to Maw, Savage, or Grievous. Better yet, they are not given the same amount of sympathy or understanding as other characters who are disabled, especially if we are comparing them to Vader. For instance, like I mentioned before, there is in-canon ableism toward Maw, from Obi-Wan in the Clone Wars and Ahsoka in her novel, and for the most part, the fandom finds these instances humorous and fitting. Better yet, the fandom believes that Maw deserves the ableism thrown his way because he is a villain. On top of that, Maw's cybernetics are added in and animated in a way to make him look like a monster, or to make him look scarier. The fact that one of their prime uses is to help him walk, because he cannot walk without them, is ignored, and they are used mainly for scare tactics and effects. Likewise, we see this with Grievous. Grievous is a Kalish and obtained his cybernetics after he was badly injured. He is by definition disabled, yet his disability is turned into a horror story. He is described as a monster, an abomination, and he is feared by the other characters. And again, he needs his armor to survive. He will die without it. He too suffers from chronic pain, yet that isn't something that is focused on. The fact that his armor is literally there to keep him alive isn't something emphasized. And lastly, there is Savage, whose whole presence is tied to being a monstrosity. And when I discuss Savage and ableism, I see two different ways to approach it. There's the body modification that resulted in loss of consent and mind, and then there's the fact that he lost his arms and is still deemed a monster and viewed in a negative way. And I have certain thoughts about how Savage's body modifications specifically were rooted in ableism. This idea that he wasn't acceptable as a lean, skinny Night Brother, so he has to be modified to be muscular and aggressive and inherently deemed a monster. But I haven't gotten those ideas down yet, or that meta down yet. For now, that is it, and I just wanted to discuss ableism amongst villains that the fandom kind of ignores or invalidates in regard to set disabilities. Their disabilities are made jokes, or they are made to seem like monsters, and these characters aren't given the same amount of sympathy as, let's say, Vader. But before I officially end this podcast, I want to look at some of the responses. The most recent reply is from Bludgeoning Butch, who said, I just want to add that the chronic pain for Grievous. In the 2003 series, Grievous had a powerful general, then Mace, use his Force ability called Force Crush, considered a forbidden dark art by the Jedi, to essentially crush the armor around Grievous's body. This damages his lungs and stature, causing him great chronic pain, coughing, awkward gait, and this is more apparent in the Clone Wars, yet his symptoms, as serious as they are treated as a joke. Exactly. His coughing and the symptoms he faces because of his injuries are treated as a joke. He is in literal pain because of his disability, and the fandom and writers made it humorous. I also believe it was bad on the part of the writers not to disclose Grievous's life and his decision to join CIS, or disclose why he did. He didn't just wake up one day and decide to join. The Jedi actually took a lot from him, and his dislike and hatred toward them is valid. Another commenter called Pierman Walker said, there's also the whole thing with breathing issues being associated with evil. The most famous example being Darth Vader can be heard before he even shows up. General Grievous's coughing serves to emphasize how damaged and horrible he is. There's also a lot of alien species who can't breathe oxygen, so they have to wear a mask. I think the reason why breathing problems equals evil is so common is that these characters have a reason to be in a creepy mask all the time. Also, Saw Gerrera, the most morally ambiguous rebel, is heavily injured, covered in cybernetics, and also needs a breathing mask. I actually have a meta I want to discuss about Saw in regards to how the narrative painted him as evil and irredeemable, whereas Callus is seen as redeemable despite participating in the Lasat genocide. Also, contrasting Saw to Mon Mothma and Jin is a huge essay I plan to write in regards to fandom mentality toward them and how Saw is basically written off as evil. But I do agree with the breathing problems. The respiratory problems, in one way or another, signify an evil or morally gray character. One that comes to mind is Vader, which was mentioned, in addition to people like Plagueis, which was mentioned by Unspeakable Horror. And lastly, I want to look at a comment left by the King Karen that reads, "And then, in Return of the Jedi, Luke's realization on how much he could become like Vader comes from the fact that he too has a mechanical hand." Yeah, that in itself is bad and blatant ableism. This idea that prosthetics and being disabled makes you somewhat closer to the worst villain in the galaxy at the time is just poor writing. Even Anakin was shamed by the Council itself for having a prosthetic arm. If I recall correctly, he was not outwardly shamed for it, but there was a certain stigma and varied emotions directed his way because of his new arm. And I think that shows us the ableism ingrained in the Star Wars universe. Whether this was intentional or not, I'm not entirely certain, but it wasn't good, nor was it very inclusive, given there are so many disabled fans who love Star Wars and who identify with it. Now, that is all. And before I go, I still want to highlight the fact that disabled villains are still an issue when it comes to representation for disabled people. The reason for this essay was to point out that certain villains are left out of these discussions and are not given the same amount of sympathy or understanding as other villains. Obviously, as I read the comments, the discussion I feel broadened, and that is a good thing. This is the first podcast I plan to make that deals with ableism. Part 2 will come soon after I make the essay and post it on my blog. Until then, I hope you enjoy, and please stay tuned for the next podcast.